Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of Constructed Criticism. This is episode of 524. I'm your host, Easy, and I'm joined by the magic coach himself, Mason Clark. How's it going, Mason?
I'm doing well. How are you, Smither?
I'm pretty good. I had a decent to decent plus day, and those are important to just recognize and have a good time. Speaking of things that are decent plus, we're going to talk about modern today for our modern power rankings. And if you're clicking on this video and you're like, oh, cool, I'm so excited to hear about these decks, awesome, we're excited to talk about them with you. But we're just going to give you the power rankings just at the beginning of this episode so that you understand what that is. You have that information that you were looking for. And if you want to move on with your day, awesome. But please leave a like because we did give you the information that you're looking for at the beginning. So the way that we break down points is we give them 6 points for first, 5 for second, 4 for top 4, 3 for top 8, 2 for top 16, and 1 for top 32 if applicable. In this one, we covered the two 10K SEGs, as well as the Modern Super Qualifier and the 3 weekend Modern Leagues. So not covering, challenges, not covering the Modern Challenge from yesterday. This gives us, in first place, Mardu with 60 points. In second place, Boros with 38 points. In third place, Ruby Storm with 31 points. In fourth place, Tron with 28 points. In fifth place, Blue-Black Murktide with 24 points. 21 points in sixth place is Temur Eldrazi Ramp. Living In comes in at seventh place with 12 points. And then Temur Underworld Breach comes in eighth place with 12 points. Those are your top 8 decks in Modern according to our power rankings based off Frank Karsten way of ranking decks. And we're going to dive into that in just a bit. Before we do, though, we want to give a shout out to our newest patron, Enrique. Thank you so much, Enrique, for joining the show. If you want to become a Patreon of $5 or more, become one of the Constructed Critics, join the wonderful community that is our Discord. It's always popping off, and we love and appreciate every single person in there. And head on over to patreon.com/ccmtg. And then don't forget to check out our sponsor at untapped.gg. The link is in the show notes for our affiliate link. If you just click that link, sign up for an account, we get a little bit of a kickback, and we really appreciate it. They are the #1 deck tracker for MTGA, and we love them. And then finally, you can also just click the store here on the YouTube channel. There should be links to the swag store, or if you're at constructedcriticism.com, you can just click on Slack and head on over there. I do know that people have been doing that. Got those notifications that people are buying them swags, man. They're buying them swags. I appreciate it. Well, let's go to our main topic. Do you want to start from the decks, or should we talk about the data? Because I have some stuff I want to talk about with the data.
I think it's important to talk a bit about the data. We were having a little bit of a pre-conversation for the patrons, but we should probably have it on air too.
Yeah, so when compiling the spreadsheet for this, it was interesting to note that the data did not match between MTGO and paper. And, you don't expect it to match. But it was actually like a pretty vast difference. If I had had more time together, I actually would have just separated out the data to show the differences. And the biggest difference was the amount of play that Mardu saw. Not just like its results, but just the number of people that obviously sleeved up the deck. And there are lots of reasons that this could happen. I mean, the biggest one is like card availability isn't an issue on MTGO. You can play whatever deck you want. MTGO players like to lean towards mid-range aggressive decks. Like, that's just a thing that is true about these style of decks. But I honestly, Mason, we started adding challenge results with the SEG results back in the day and with GP results back in the day. And I've never seen this big of a difference. And I kind of want your opinion on, like, why so much more Mardu?
Yeah, I mean, Mardu is like a subset of Boros, right? It's kind of like you have Bowmasters and you kind of believe... I mean, I was going to say, you kind of believe in that stuff like Bowmasters and Thoughtseizes a bit more than the One Ring, and somehow that makes sense on Moto, where there's like it's a lot easier to play the combo decks, I think, and combo decks can be like, when they are good, they get pivoted to a bit more. So I think there's like a lot of like the One Ring was really good in the energy decks because you generate a lot of life, you have a lot of cheap cards, but specifically as a way to counteract controlling One Ring decks, which we're seeing less of. And we're seeing more of the Eldrazi type stuff and the combo type stuff. In both of those worlds, Thoughtseize is better. We are seeing some Mardu players adapt with the One Ring instead of playing on Mixless. So I think there is kind of a weird, like, I want to say crystalling of the ideas, but that feels like the wrong word. Anyways, we're seeing players kind of move in that direction. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And when you have all the cards, like Spencer said, it's a lot easier to kind of move in that direction. There's also some amount of like the conversation right now is Mardu is the best deck. So a lot of people I think are trying Mardu or are trying the energy, excuse me, whether they like Mardu or Boros does depend on them and sort of what battles do you want to pick to fight. And so I think we're seeing a lot of people play with it. It is very powerful and is performing very well right now. And that is, leading to some real results. On paper, it's a lot more expensive to make that choice. So you might even be playing Mardu on MTGO while you save up, or maybe, like you're unsure if like this is going to be the best deck, or maybe you're worried about a banning or something, right? Obviously, we just had some, but sometimes players still worry about that stuff. And so I think there's a bit of lag in paper quite often when it comes to metagames, and especially so when it's such a big financial commitment, right? If you don't own these Mardu cards, and let's be honest, outside of like Thoughtseize and the Shocklands, you probably didn't play, I mean, I guess Bowmasters, but you didn't play a lot of these cards, you didn't have them pre-MH3. And so, like, even Aaron Mesa is a fetch land not a lot of players own because there wasn't really a reason to. So I think we're maybe seeing a little bit of that lag, and also just a difference in, like, the metagames as always, right? Like, in paper, things are always a little different than Magic Online. They're different games. I think Magic Online often looks more like an idealized version of sort of what, like, the spikiest metagame looks like. And it's important to remember that when someone enters an SCG 10K, like the Friday one was $10 to enter, for example. That is a very low barrier to entry. That's cheaper than some FNMs, right? And it's like, you're entering a $10 10K. If you live in Florida, your Magic friends are probably going. You probably just go, enter, and you play whatever deck you want. It's $10, like, I don't know. And I think that sort of thing is important to remember, too, that sometimes the reason you play MTGO is to sort of compete and sort of, grind value, quote unquote, and sharpen your skills. Where sometimes in paper, the incentives aren't always the same. And there are people who definitely do that, don't get me wrong. But there are also people who just go to like play their deck, or they love Modern, or they love this new deck, or they just love competing, but not at the highest level, like doing it their own way. And so I think paper and MTG are totally different games, just to be kind of bluntly honest. And to seeing this, I think it's sort of like the actualization of like very expensive cards. People are unsure and adapting. And, to me, it's not even clear if like energy will stay at the top 6 months from now. I think we said when we talked about the BNR, I guess what was that now, Spencer, 2.5 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago? We talked about how like I'm personally really interested in like what a month from now to 4 months to 6 months looks like, right? Like when we get a lot of time to explore a lot of these new cards, and a lot of cards that like, Grief helped push down, right? Like combo decks that weren't playing Grief had a hard time surviving against the Grief aggressive decks. What does the format look like? And I'm very interested to see. And I think one of the interesting things about energy, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, is that it feels to me like a lot of the energy stuff has reached its kind of final stage of, like what it's going to be outside of the sideboard tech, like metagame things. And so it's very easy to play a deck like this when that happens. But I'm curious your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said. And there's another kind of piece of data that I think really supports the idea that they are so different. There were 23 different decks that got points between the two paper 10Ks. There was one deck added from the other 4 events. So that brings our total to 24 decks getting points.
Oh, I see. Just to make sure the listeners understand. You're saying in the SCG, there are 23 unique deck types.
Yep.
Right? Like Death Shadow, Infect, Merfolk, whatever it is. Yeah. And on Magic Online, you're saying the number of types of decks was very small.
I don't know that it was small. There was only one deck added. To be fair, like having 23 different decks get points to start with. I just happened to start with the SCGs first and not to do the the other 4 events yet, right? But and then also I didn't use the top 32 points from the challenges because they were so much smaller than the SCGs. So even though we have the data on the top 32s for the 64 challenges, some of them were like a quarter the size, a quarter the size of these SCGs. And so it didn't really make sense to give the top 32 of a person that went, 4-3, the same number of points of a person that had to battle through, 11 rounds.
Sure. But yes, yeah. No, sure. That makes sense.
And I not to say that like there's just some decks that like there also some decks did way better on MTGO that aren't Mardu and Boros. Like Twiddle Storm I think only got 1 point from paper. I ended up with 11 points in the data, putting it 10 points in the data, tying it for 10th/11th with Domain Zoo.
I believe it had a challenge win, right? This past weekend was one of its finishes. I remember someone tweeted that they split the finals of the challenge, and then they were waking up in 5 hours to play the deck in paper. And there's someone who mains that deck.
Twiddle did get a challenge win in one of the 64s this week.
Yeah.
And I don't know. It is just I don't often like feel the way I felt when I make these power rankings. I've never felt like this. I was like, holy crap, is like Goryo's suddenly going to sneak up there? Like a bunch of people played Goryo's in MTGO. There was one challenge that Ruby Storm took first, second, and had a top 8. Like, there were just a lot of outliers in the data this week.
That makes sense. I think one speaks to kind of actually how healthy Modern is. Like, you might look at the energy decks at the top, but I mean, if you believe this is the end state of the Modern format when it comes to its like ability to adapt and stuff, then sure, I don't. So I don't really see it. I see it as just like this is the easiest deck to figure out, and it is quite powerful, and it is appealing to a lot of players. So that makes sense. And so to me, it seems like there's a lot of decks and a lot of room to explore. I do want to talk about Twiddle Storm really quickly while we headed up here.
Yeah.
I think that deck is good, and it kind of makes sense to me that it doesn't see a lot of paper play. The big reason is I think sometimes in paper, people are more afraid to play something like this. Like, you're spending a lot of time going to this SCG, right? Sometimes there can be like a feeling of like not wanting to take risk. We're playing unproven deck. And Twiddle Storm has been like, I think quietly one of the better combo decks. And I heard Javier talk about it on his podcast. And he was talking about how he thinks Twiddle Storm is like better than actual Storm in theory, because actual Storm is stronger. Like, it is a more powerful, kills you quicker deck. Like, you can die on turn 1 to Ruby Storm if you're on the draw with the Gemstone. It's happened to me. It could happen to you, And so, like, that is obviously an insanely high ceiling. But the cards that people play against you, while some of them do hit Twiddle, like Damping Sphere, not all of them hit them in the same way. And they can just sort of circumvent some amount of this hate, right? And they get to be really consistent still and do a really good job of killing their opponents. So I think Twiddle Storm is like actually one of the best combo decks in Pioneer right now, personally. I'm unsure if I think if it's better than actual Ruby Storm, but I'm also pretty medium on Ruby Storm. So, that's like a me thing.
Yeah, I think that, I'll make sure for what it's worth that at least the top 10 decks are posted in the show notes so that people can kind of see that information. If you want the full spreadsheet to see every point that every deck got, head on over to patreon.com/CCBG. We post the doc for everybody to see for our patrons of $5 or more every time we do this. One of the other things that you kind of mentioned it when talking about Mardu, but from the bans, it's like, what's going to change? Like, what does removing Nadu and these other this stuff, what does it do to the format? And it kind of looks to me like it's split into combo decks and Thoughtseize decks and mid-range decks. And then it just so happens that Mardu happens to be a mid-range Thoughtseize deck. Well, if you think about it, like mono black, mid range Thoughtseize deck.
I think Mono Black's a control deck for what it's worth.
That's
Or like a
fair. I was
controlling
actually
combo
just
deck.
gonna say,
Yeah.
you could maybe classify some of these as controlled, like
Mhm.
for example, blue black Murktide was actually often listed as blue black control, and I had to go in to make sure that all of them that were listed as control had Murktides, so that if there were like a ring Shieldred deck that
Mhm.
wasn't playing Murktide, that they were separate points on the data. That didn't happen. All of the blue black decks were a Murktide variant. But
Mhm.
it's interesting to me that like Thoughtseize would see such a big spike in a format that, in all honesty, hasn't really been about Thoughtseize in a long time, in my opinion. Not like as its like pillar.
Yeah, well, I think Grief was doing that, right?
I guess that's true. That's a fair point.
Yeah, just we had Thoughtseize with a body, and so we were doing that to each other, and that was a big part of the point.
That's a good point.
Yeah, and I think too when you like look at what's happening, like a lot of my read is the energy decks kind of became the de facto decks that people are talking about, and there's a lot of look in that direction. Those decks struggle against the sort of rampy big mana decks, and like there's varying degrees of how much you believe Temur through the breach, which we have labeled as Temur Eldrazi, which I think is a good way to
they're actually different. They're actually different.
Oh yeah, okay, sweet. Well,
Temur,
great.
like the spawning Mycosynth one ring ramp.
Is this like, yeah? So is it like not playing through the breach?
Most, I believe, none of them were playing through the breach.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's good to know. Yeah, so because I'd say there is just like a actual ramp deck, which is I think honestly kind of impressive. Like Modern's never had like a real ramp deck. It's always been a combo deck that like ramps the scape shift, right? And these decks just play like a lot of world break. I mean, there are versions they differ, but like one of the big things is an Emrakul that you think is the best, and then World Breaker, and then ways to get there really quickly with Kozilek's Return and Kozilek's Command. And that has been like a really successful strategy over the last couple of weeks, which is really interesting to see.
Yeah, it was really interesting kind of going through it. I didn't expect kind of a divergence between the Eldrazi Tron decks and the Eldrazi ramp decks, because we were already to a point where we were like playing talismans in our Tron decks, and then we're just like, well, let's just ditch Tron just play all of the soul lands, these this 4-drop that ramps me, these talismans. It is a departure. It's a deck that I definitely have not tried yet that I want to try.
Yeah, I think you would really like it. It seems like a deck you would enjoy. I also think it really leans into the strength of Malevolent Rumble when you're using Emrakul the Promised End as one of your payoff cards. Because now you have Malevolent Rumble, which ramps you, also can be like a chump blocker, if your opponent's putting some pressure on you or something, right? Like a Terror Trover or Kabu's attacking you, getting an extra turn can be huge. And then you're sculpting your game plan, and then you're slamming down, these big Eldrazi. And if your Malevolent Rumble mills over something like Kozilek's Return, well, now you're cleaning up all those creatures. So there's a lot of really good synergy in these decks.
One of the things that was interesting to me is I didn't actually see through the breach decks listed on any of these, and I'm pretty sure that it had won the 2 supers before this weekend.
Yeah, I thought it did well. I don't know if it won, but I remember it doing well in one of them for sure. Because I know that like I used one of the finishing decks from a couple weeks ago as the basis for my MTGO Masters deck, and I just changed some stuff because of the rules of MTGO Masters. But like, I think that deck is good. One thing I've heard from players is they feel, and I felt this a little when playing it, that it feels a bit clunky. And in comparison to the other Eldrazi stuff, like through the breaching someone on turn 3, like we ramp that out is and sometimes turn 2, but like on turn 3 is obviously really strong. But you have a lot of jointedness, and it makes sense if you think of the format in the pillars of like aggressively slanted mid-range decks with Thoughtseize, go big decks and combo decks. It makes sense that like Through the Breach might struggle against one version of that, and then the Malevolent Rumbling and other like Tron typically good against stuff like Living End, typically good against stuff like Storm because of its ability to like get a Karn down, get the sideboard card. It makes sense that like those versions would be good here, but then maybe the Eldrazi versions aren't as good. And Through the Breach ends up in this weird, like, kind of stumbling against Thoughtseize, kind of in a race against the combo decks. Maybe I should just be leaning in one of these other directions, So
Yeah, that's totally fair. I mean, from the paper events, Tron was the best performing deck by like a country mile in paper. And I just, I kind of expected that trend to continue on MTGO because I think that we looked at the data a little while ago. Tron was favored against the energy decks in the data. So you would think that like that would be a natural deck for people to go to. I think we looked at that actually on the Patreon only episode. Now that I'm saying that out loud.
I was going to say, I do think Tron has some issues. Like I mentioned how it's better against Storm, but that's like in comparison to the other Eldrazi decks, right? Like I still don't think you're good against them. You just have more game. So
yeah, one of the decks that Tron is actually historically has a kind of a coin flipping matchup against though is Living End, which came roaring back into this into these power rankings. What do you think there?
Yeah, I think Living End is quite good. It makes sense to me. Like if you think about that deck versus the Mardu deck, like Mardu, obviously they're trying to thought seize you to some extent, right? But I'm just going to call it energy for now on, by the way, because I think the difference is really like how do you want your flex slots to be? And you're playing the same core game plan of get creatures down early, apply pressure, disrupt. In the energy decks, they aren't very good at stopping that stuff, and they have a lot of soft sideboard hate when it comes to the graveyard because they're using their own Flage. Even though they could be a Rest in Peace deck, because so many players are leaning on Flage, and they want Flage in the mirrors, they're leaning on cards like Soul Guide Lantern, which can be fine, but are much more beatable than cards like Rest in Peace. And in general, the format as a whole has moved away from graveyard hate. And so it makes sense to me that Living End, despite losing Grief, which was, a great card in that deck, still quite good. And typically, what we learned from the past when it comes to these Cascade decks is when there isn't the proper hate for them, they are very hard to like overpower. And the energy decks aren't really doing much to like stop that. Like, I guess the biggest thing they have going for them is Goblin Bombardment gives you a way to like rebuild your board. But if you don't have your opponent low and you just like sack a couple dice and I put in a bunch of 7/7s and 4/4 flyers, you're gonna have issues.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense to me, to be honest. Just kind of to round this out before we kind of talk about what we would play and why. Grinding Station with some new cards has entered the fray. The Tamiyo and Six specifically were in the Corey Baumeister version of the deck.
And Malevolent Rumble. That was a big one there. Yep.
And I'm curious, like, as a person that has not been a Breach believer, like I was not a part of the Church of Breach before. What do you think of these changes, Mason?
I'm curious what you think, because you just said you didn't really believe in the deck.
I just didn't think that it was. A lot of people were like, "This is the best thing in Modern" by like a country mile for a couple weeks.
And sure, that was during Yurion, so they were just wrong. Everyone says they have a good matchup versus Yurion, and then all their decks didn't get banned, and so
yeah, that's all I meant. Is like
sure.
I don't know that there was ever truly a time where this was the best thing to be doing in Modern. But it actually looks pretty good right now. And I think that some of that has to do with Tamiyo over Ragavan. I think that's a pretty big upgrade for this deck. And then the fact that it kind of gets to be a one-ring combo deck that, I don't know, that's just very inviting to me.
By the way, I would like to point out that the format is energy cards. Let's sometimes play the One Ring. Decks that abuse the One Ring, and then combo decks trying to get underneath the One Ring. And that's the whole format. Anyways, we move. Yeah, I think through the Breach deck is interesting. So when Breach originally popped up, right, like I actually teamed with Jesse the weekend where like she kind of popped off that deck and it sort of entered the zeitgeist. The reason to play it then was it was really good against 4-colory stuff. Like if you're trying to be slow and methodical, this deck was like able to grind through everything enough because of Underworld Breach and present this combo kill. And a lot of the cards lined up well against the answers at the time. And it was fast enough that against other modern decks, you could combo and you had kind of the tools to fight other fights. Now we fast forward 2 years. Some of that is still true. And I think there are spots where it's like against Mardu, you are fast enough and able to compete with a little bit of what's going on with them, that it's not the end of the world. and you can have a couple cards that can be good against like, Tron or combo decks. Like if you're, Tormod script doubles as a combo enabler and a way to stop your opponent from comboing, that is like a really good place to be. I think Corey played Soul Guy Lantern this weekend, which didn't make a ton of sense to me. And I'll ask him next week, and I'm playing the Apex team event with him, and he's playing the Breach deck, so I'm curious to see what he does. But, I think the deck does have some real game to it. My big problems with the Breach deck have always been, one, I felt like, and I don't know if this is just like a Mason's the GOAT or whatever, but I've played against Breach a lot because I like play tested with Jesse a lot to help her with the initial builds. And I don't really lose to like Breach players. Like I played against Corey at events, I played against Jesse. I kind of always beat them, but I also know what's going on with them. In fact, the one time I've lost is a time where my opponent accidentally, we missed them cheating to start the combo because of an Embry situation. It was all an accident, but that's the only time I've lost. And so when I play against the deck, I feel like when I know what I'm doing and I have the right tools, which aren't even like the biggest, like the hardest tools to have, I feel really good at versus the deck. And I often feel like I watch people play against this deck. Like I watched Corey's backpack stream, and it feels like they don't know what's going on because the deck is so fringe. And so sometimes I wonder, like Corey Baumeister, former Platinum Pro, clearly a great player. He knows his deck inside out, has been playing it for 2 years. His opponents don't know these things. Like how much of an edge is that for Corey? And I know from talking to Corey that he does like value kind of like a cherry on top of the sundae. It isn't the reason he plays it, but he does value that often his opponents don't quite understand what his game plans are. So I'm curious, like as this deck enters the metagame more, as I see more people tweeting about picking it up, how will it do? Because I do think it is powerful and good, but it is unclear to me that if it can survive the hate if targeted. But currently, people aren't playing those cards. So like, you know what? If people aren't playing the cards, you're a lot better deck. So that's kind of where I am on the deck.
We just talked about Living End, right? It's just true in Magic.
Yep.
So what would you play?
I think I'll play Yogg. I'm very happy playing Yogg. I played Yogg at my RCQ and won, which isn't really anything, but I felt very good about the deck there. I feel good about my matchups, and yeah, I plan to play Yogg. I think Tron's quite good. Like if I had to play one of the decks listed today, I would play one of the Eldrazi variants, I think. Maybe if you got me like tune my blue-black Murktide deck, I'd be down, which we didn't really talk about. We kind of mentioned it in passing. But I think those decks are better than the Murktide decks of old, but aren't significantly better. So I don't know. That's kind of where I'm at. Maybe I'd twiddle snore if I felt comfortable.
We have a team event, and I believe Matt Kling is in our modern seat this weekend for our 1K plus. And we were kind of talking about this data. I sent it over to my teammates, and we were chatting. And yeah, like if I was in the modern seat this weekend, I would play Murktide or Tron. I think that both decks offer some control elements that I enjoy when playing. Both have the ability to ask a question, which I think I always like. And yeah, that's kind of where I would be. It's a little bit different, right? Like one of them is like a one ring deck, and one of them is just like a Thoughtseize deck, but
yeah, I think those decks are good. I even mentioned, playing like an Eldrazi deck or maybe the Murks, so we're in a very similar swap. I guess I'll say I would play Agatha, Soul Cauldron, Yogg. In my mind, I just wouldn't play Birthing Ritual right now. Yeah. But I just want to make sure to make that clear to listeners.
Yeah, and I think you did a good job last week, kind of, while I was not on the show, kind of talking about it in I think it was the second half of the show. Just talking about your thought process behind Yogg. I don't know, I really enjoyed that part of that episode, and as a listener, so that is going to do it. Like I said, I'll just to recap, just the top 8 really quick. We have Mardu and Boros Energy at 1 and 2, Ruby Storm Tron at 3 and 4, Blue Black Murk and Temur Ramp at 5 and 6, Living End and Temur Underworld Breach at 7 and 8. So it was interesting. I included all of the double-digit point getters. To have Mono Black, Domain Zoo, and Total Storm next coming in, all within 2 points of the 8th place deck, was pretty interesting to me.
Yep. Yeah, I think one thing that we talk about sometimes, but it's important to notice for power rankings, is little differences have huge impact, right? And like if you win a challenge, for example, Twiddle Storm, right? that gives you half the points you need to be in the 2-point bracket. That doesn't mean your deck's bad. We even talked about how, like, at least personally, I like Twiddle Storm, but sometimes like a good finish can really change the numbers on this. And sometimes, like in this case, it's pretty dramatic, the difference between Mardu and everything else. But we've definitely had power rankings in the past where it's like, well, these two challenge results flipped. We would just be talking about how this deck is the number one deck.
Yeah, it's so funny too, because when we break down the top 8 decks, I usually have the tiebreaker be, and how I list them, this is just info for the listener, is the deck with the most finishes is actually placed higher than the deck with the highest finish.
Assuming points are even.
Yes, exactly.
Yep. Yeah, which I think is a good tiebreaker. It just kind of makes sense. Like, if your deck's consistently performing versus, it spiked 2 challenges, Maybe it's just Dom Harvey playing Amulet all the time.
I actually remember there was a weekend where Green Red Scape Shift won multiple challenges, or like won both challenges that weekend, but like had no other results and came in like a lower place, and I was so sad. That's going to do it for the power rankings. Let us know your thoughts. What do you think the top decks are? Is the paper versus MTGO thing relevant to you? Does it impact you when you're looking for deck lists to build off of or to test versus? Let us know. Leave a comment, whether it's on Spotify or on YouTube.
And so really quick before we move on, I want to hear your answer to that question. What does that affect you?
I think that this weekend specifically, I would now, because of the results of Living End on MTGO, I would be more prepared for Living End now.
So you think, just to make sure I understand correctly,
in paper too, like I'm saying,
yeah. So yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, I've always felt like they're different, and I think about them a little differently. But I think MTGO is like often in the future, and paper lags behind a little bit. That's kind of how I think about it.
I agree, and that to me that means that Living End is in a really good spot in paper right now, and thus I think that people who really like that deck gravitate towards it when it is good, kind of like Affinity or those style decks. And I would pack Living End hate right now. I think that you will get some free wins in the winner's metagame by understanding that is happening.
Oh, I wanted to talk about this really quickly in the main topic. And so I guess people who listen to the whole show can get a little bit of a thing. We mentioned Goryo's in passing, and I wanted to talk about the deck, but we had I remember us saying the word. So in my mind, when I was like mentally recapping at the end, I was like, we talked about Goryo's. Thinking about it, we didn't.
I'm curious. It did not make the top 10 decks.
Yes. What are your thoughts on Goryo's? Because this is the deck I hear a lot about, and I have some real thoughts, but I'm curious your thoughts on it.
I have played against this deck. I think this deck is in a place where it doesn't have its identity clear yet. And I am scared to... Also, I will say that some of Goryo's points came from Brad, who was not playing, I believe, like a traditional build, or
he was playing kind of the new stock build.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I was watching Corey's stream. Yeah. Okay. Believe it or not, Brad Nelson played a stock deck list, folks.
I think that you just kind of like pull up a list and you see a lot of 1-ofs and 3-ofs. It looks like something that I would have tuned for 3 months in a lot of ways.
Is that a pejorative, or is that a...
I don't know. It depends. Like
the way you're saying it makes it sound that way with your tone of voice, but not with the words you're saying. So I'm just confused. I'm just trying to get a straight answer.
Sometimes it's a good thing, and sometimes it's like, just put the best cards in your deck, Spencer. And, I think that this deck is not at the point where it puts the best cards in its deck.
Sure. I think that's fair. I think if you told me I couldn't play Yogg and I had to play a deck that wasn't one of our top 8 decks, I think it would be Esper Goryo's. I do think the deck is really strong, and I think it's doing a lot of powerful things. I think, like Spencer said, there seems to be a lot of dissension. No, not dissension, but weirdness going on in tradition to kind of where it even was before Grief, where people are doing some things to try to adapt to where it needs to be in the metagame. And I think just in general, like a blue-black interactive deck with Frog is pretty good, as we've seen from blue-black Murk. And this just has a combo finish compared to like a Murk Tidy finish and has less interaction than that deck does. And that deck's just a pile of counter spells and kill spells. So I don't know. I think this deck is good. I'm really interested to see it in the coming weeks. I think if you're someone who likes this deck, it makes a lot of sense to play it. I will say I heard people say the thing, Spencer, they always say about Hogak, where they're like, they banned Bridge from Below and Hogak got better, which, former co-host of the show, Matt Kling, your friend, and I always joke about, where it's like, no, it didn't. Like the deck was worse. It just had to change in a way where it accidentally like got a little bit better against hate, but the deck was worse overall. And I think I've heard people talk about that with Grief, where I can't remember their name. There's a Mitgo grinder who very popular this deck we talked about in the past, but he was talking about how like ephemerating Grief wasn't even one of the things he wanted to do. That was in his opening hand. Like he often wanted to wait to do that. And he was like, people would just do that and like end up in these places where he thought it wasn't very tactically smart. So now they can't like pitch their good cards and put a Grief and Ephemerate on the stack. They're going to win more. And I'm curious to see how that plays out. Because I do think like, just playing Thoughtseize or whatever doesn't let you sort of do that. And you get to save your Ephemerates for the cards and the plays that matter. So I think it's going to be really cool to see this in the coming months.
Yeah, I need to correct myself. After looking at these, it does look like Brad is literally just playing the new, basically the new stock.
Brad, love you to death or whatever, but does just play stock decks these days because he's busy running a company. Homie goes out, he just takes a deck he likes. I heard him talking on Corey's stream. He's like, I don't even know if I have a good Boros matchup. He's like, I just like it.
To be fair, there are a lot less 3-ofs in Brad's version of the deck than the.
Sure.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's very interesting.
That is going to do it for the power ranking segment. Let's move on to always improving. Always improving is the point of the show. And the way that, we look at it is we're trying to get better. You're trying to get better. It's the point of the podcast, right? That's why you come to a show like this. And, we try to kind of practice what we preach. This week, or I guess I didn't do the last 2 weeks because I was out last week, so I'll kind of just summarize. Last time I talked, I was talking about just trying to have more fun in Magic again and really enjoying the game and making it a point to enjoy the game while also treating my shots at the game more kind of like Abe's always improving moment from I actually kind of talked about it 2 weeks in a row. That's a very Michael Hinderocker thing to do, Abe. I really have been appreciating like a moment in Magic recently. And not just like, this is my moment to shine or whatever. Like, I think I used to think that way, but it's like, this is every opportunity, every moment is a moment in Magic, whether it is, just a match that I'm teaching Maxwell cards. Cause I actually bought 2 standard decks. Maxwell and I I'm going to teach Maxwell how to play Magic finally. I think he's ready to learn. And it's something that, his reading needed to get to a certain level. He loves like learning new words and things like that. And he's great at math and I think he's going to get it. But taking those individual moments and saying like, okay, what can I learn from this opportunity? And kind of not taking them for granted. Because, last week I wasn't on the show because my daughter had a double ear infection and pneumonia. Maxwell had pink eye and an allergic reaction to the smoke blowing in from California that hits Utah with the wind every year. And it was just like, it was a crazy week. And I was like, okay, well, what's my next thing? What can I spend my time in Magic doing? And what can I have this moment be when I do get that moment? And I gotta tell you, man, I won a lot of gems on Arena playing a brew. Go me, Mason called me a brewer. Next time I come on the show, it's like
you've been a brewer for how many years?
I know, but like it was important to me to like put my RPG points in the right basket for right now. And yeah, I need to record a deck tech still, but I've been working on this deck that I call Turtle Surprise, which is exactly what it sounds like, but it's just a cool deck name. Did you see it? Did you look at it?
Yeah, I saw it. Cool.
Were you like, this is the darkest deck of all time?
I mean, it looked a lot like a deck you would play.
Yeah,
I'll say.
I mean that's
Yeah,
true.
yeah.
But yeah, I've really been enjoying it. But I actually left it up to my teammates this week. I was like, hey, like, I've got trophies with these decks. These are the decks that I feel comfortable with. Like, how much do you trust just a random brew in a team event? And they were both like, dude, if you want to play the deck and you believe in it, like, let's do it. I don't know. That was like kind of gratifying. It like kind of felt like the old days where I was like, I think we should put Evolving Wilds in our deck so that we can play Plains out of the sideboard, so that both it triggers, Aetherworks Marvel, and then post board we can play white cards. Like it was like that level of like Spencer's madness. So
Nice. That's awesome. I'm glad you're having fun and getting ready for that.
I
So you're
I think the thing though, just because I kind of rambled there, it was about the moments. Like, we did that episode that's probably not even on Spotify or stuff anymore because of the change, but we did my RPG points theory episode, and I really tried to put them into things that I enjoyed and that I thought could win.
nice. Awesome.
What about you?
Yeah. My always improving moment comes from having to play Pioneer all the time for the stupid RC in DC. No, always improving moment really came from trying to think about how to solve problems. So specifically, one of the big things that's happening in Pioneer over the last, say, 2 weeks is that people are starting to realize the red creature decks are really good. And like Slick Shot, the Mice from Standard, the Prowess creatures, Soulscar Mage to a Spear, just like a strong shell, Kamana Face Kakuzan. And they're realizing that that's good. And then in combination with like some black cards, specifically Callous Short, which basically just has a fling at the adventure side and is like an okay body. And combining that with the mouse just does a lot of damage, lets you be very fast, has like a good Phoenix matchup, has a pretty decent sack matchup. And I was like, okay, these look pretty good, but I want to try Innkeeper's Talent as a way to, one, be good against removal spells, and two, I'm going to be playing these green cards anyways to help give trample to solve some of the similar problems. Like, the point of the fling is to push damage. And I was like, well, what if I try this? And while I think that there is something good about that deck, I think that ultimately it doesn't even matter if it's better or worse than the other deck. It was just a matter of like, okay, this is one way to solve the problem. That's great. Let's just take a look at how other people, what they're doing, and see if there's other things I can do to learn from them and go a different direction. Because so often I think what happens in Magic is people see something and they latch on to it and they don't really try to iterate. And so a lot of times I feel like I need to be trying to iterate in order to like make sure things are fully explored and we're not just getting lazy. And this was a situation of doing it in a very extreme way. Instead of just playing that deck and maybe changing the sideboard cards a little bit or something like that, I just went a totally different direction while trying to solve the same problem. And that was really telling and helpful for just my understanding of the format at large, where it's like, well, the decks I tried to beat, I was very good against, but I lost a lot against the random kind of nonsense, where I think the black deck gains a lot versus those decks because Thoughtseize covers so many of those matchups. And the fling is just a better card if someone's trying to race you. If we're just trying to like kill each other really quickly, doubling my damage on a turn is massive, right? If I Slick Shot show off you for like 7 and then do another 7, that's really, really strong. Where, yeah, I'm better against creatures, I'm better against removal, but I'm too slow in these other matchups is really going to hurt me. And so it was just really helpful in all that stuff.
I really love that. And, obviously people know that I'm like a huge fan of these style of decks. And I really thought that our conversation in the Discord was interesting because the second that I saw people put Innkeeper's Talent in there, in their decks. I was like, this is not how I would solve this problem. And then you and I had like a little chat about that, and honestly, just like hot take, nothing to do with your always improving segment. I'm sorry, but like I saw Shaper's Sanctuary is a card that I've never believed in, but it actually makes a little bit of sense in a Slickshot deck. So that was
that is interesting for sure. I think the big thing, and for what it's worth, like the conversation we basically had, you can have this by joining the Patreon. See,
you could have seen this 5 days ago.
Yeah, but like I posted the deck and I tagged Spencer and was like, Spencer, I know you play a lot of these decks. What are your thoughts? And he like circles my Innkeeper's Talent and says nonsense or whatever. It doesn't solve any problems. And I'm like, all right, well, I'm playing right now and it's actively being. I'm like winning all the things. He's like DMing me while I'm winning with Innkeeper's Talent because I just took a turn off the level and plot and then passed and then redid. And it was just like, okay, well, I had this happen for a little bit now and it seems kind of good. And then we had a conversation about it from there, And I think it's other things than that, where it's like it actually solves problems, but creates other issues where I'm losing opportunity costs of other cards.
Yeah.
And like the green mana actually is like it's a lot of your deck.
It's a lot of mana.
I actually don't think it's a ton of mana, like in the context of the deck. I think it's like the green sources are actually the problem. Where like I need to have the first green source. Oh, I thought you meant like the amount of mana to put.
No, you have to win a lot of games on red mana in this deck because we don't know that. This is like maybe post game content or post podcast content, but I like the deck. We talked about this with Abe a little bit, but the Slickshot decks require like raw cardboard to happen, and so when you spend 2 mana on a piece of cardboard, it needs to make either an impact or get you more cardboard pretty often.
Mm-hmm.
And so, to me, like just putting to be fair, I have not played the Heartfire Hero version yet in Pioneer because I was doing other things. It does make more sense in that version, which you did have, but that's just some initial thoughts.
Yeah, I think the Innkeeper's Talent generates multiple pieces of cardboard, just not in a bursty way, like Slickshot does. If that makes sense. Like I think it's worse with Slickshot, but better with the other cards in the deck that I have, and so it's a really interesting sort of thing. It also like there's some amount of, and I realize this keeps happening to me because I don't tell people, but like I'm like playing with the thought that Pyroclasm is in the format because I'm testing for an event where Pyroclasm is in the format. And Innkeeper's Talent does a good job of helping me get my cards consistently out of.
You did not say that. That is, do we know that is in the in Frontiers?
No, it's in Duskmourn. It got previewed like 2 weeks ago.
It did?
Yeah, it was like all over Twitter. I have a tweet with like 1,000 likes about it.
Dude, yeah. You have to remember, I had 2 sick kids at once, Mason.
Well, let me just tell you, Pyroclasm's in it, and honestly, I think this is another good always improving one for me. To me, it is obvious that I should only be caring about Duskmourn Pioneer, and so I'm trying to be like, what does the world look like with Pyroclasm? I think one of my bigger takeaways, which I can like I guess share here real quick, is like, and I've thought this too before I even started playing, and maybe you can think about this really quick as you now learn Pyroclasm is going to be in Pioneer in 2 weeks. I think Pyroclasm is really good versus Convoke. I think Convoke can play around Pyro. I don't think Pyroclasm is actually even that good versus the red decks. And I have played some Pioneer with it where like they all grow, and like a big part of it too is Kamano faces Kakuzan.
Yes.
Where like your turn 1 play, even on the draw, doesn't walk into the Pyro. So even if I want to go like turn 2 Pyro, turn 3 like Fate, let's just say Fable. I think it's a bad example, but Fable into something, like I don't even hit your thing. And then all of your creatures very easily outgrow it. And in an open deckless environment, if you just have like 2 brain cells and can afford to hold up a mana, I play Pyro and I get countered. You like hit me with a burn spell or something. I'm like, I'm dead. I lose. And I like committed this mana in my time. Yeah. And so I don't know. I think Pyro is going to be good, but it's just not like backbreaking.
This was actually pretty common in like the red aggressive mirrors in Pioneer a couple months ago, where you would position yourself to get an X3 in the mirror because it would take over the board. Or like, It just wasn't that hard. It's like between. It was actually one of the reasons to play like Snakeskin Veil over like Blossoming Defense or like stuff like that.
So, also,
How deep are we going on this one?
I want to say something that's very funny. Spencer, the screenshot I shared of my Gruul deck has Pyroclasm in my board. When I asked you to look at my deck, Pyroclasm is in the sideboard because I was building the one to play test like the future Pioneer. So it's very funny. But two, I was gonna say, yeah, like just like Monstrous Rage does a great job of getting you like above it. Snakeskin Veil does a job of that. That's a card that like I'm trying over Blossoming Defense in these kind of decks. Like, but just Prowess in general gets you above. And Slick Shot is like the only card that on its own doesn't get like above that range. But also it's the one that you can plot.
Right.
So like, and it's also the one where like if they don't kill it like when it's hitting you, it often doesn't matter.
Yep.
It's like, okay, I killed it after it did 9 damage to me. I guess I'm dead still, you know? So it's very interesting.
If you want to ask questions on the show, like our patrons, send it on to patreon.com/you become a patron of $5 or more. Like Susanna, who asks, do you have any tips or recommend resources for getting better at planning out and using your sideboard? In a post-Nadu world, I have cut harsh mentors, but I'm still figuring out how I should how much I should have against each matchup. Ooh, man. I think that we have done multiple episodes on building sideboard guides, building sideboards.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that if you just go through the catalog, you will find them on YouTube as well as the website, as well as Spotify. Like most of it should be there. For me, the way that I learned this the best was I remember reading. Actually, there was a moment that made me want to get better at this, and I think that it was Carmen was doing SCG coverage, and she made a joke about, "Oh, I see that they're trimming, so they don't know what this matchup is about." And I was like, "Oh man, I do that every time. I don't know what a matchup is about." And don't get me wrong, I still do that when I don't know what a matchup is about. But it is something that I really wanted to improve out of, like, being able to definitively understand, like, what is important right now, right? And I think that you will find articles and videos about building your own sideboard guides that teach you way more than paying $5 for an empty Joe Grinder sideboard guide about, okay, that can teach you what they believe it's about, right? Like what they believe this matchup is about. But the challenge becomes, and what I have taught in coaching almost every time, like this kind of question comes up, is like, I don't understand sideboarding. I always just pay for a guide. I'm like, let's do it. Like, let's sit down together and build our guides against the first 8 decks on Goldfish. Because it then gives you a practice of like, I believe this matchup is about this. And then we have a conversation and you have to defend your answers. The number one resource for this is really having a community or somebody to talk to. One of the reasons that I like to take screenshots of how I'm sideboarding when I'm playing Arena or MTGO and save it with the deck name that I'm playing against is so that I can be like, hey, here's how I sideboarded. Here, what do you think of this? And then I can say, you know, here's what I think the match is about and have conversations later. I think that those conversations are more important than any podcast or resource that I would direct you to, because they are an active participation that you would have to engage in. How are you, Mason?
Yeah, so I will link you a thing in the Patreon Discord along with everyone else. It's just a doc someone put together basically of like all the best Magic articles of all time when it came to like improving and stuff. And there's a lot of docs there if you just Control F and search for sideboard, where you can read a lot of people's thoughts over the last 20 years about that sort of thing. And you'll find varying degrees of help just because of the nature of it. My advice to you would be to do something very similar to what Spencer was talking about, of like, you need to kind of understand what you think matters in the matchup from both sides and what the goal of both decks are. Kind of like mediating a conversation. Like, you need to understand where both sides are coming from if you're going to come to a conclusion. And then when you're specifically your question about like, how do I know what my sideboard cards should be and what my number should be? My suggestion when I always tell people is there are lots of ways to go about building a sideboard. And I personally really fall in the camp of I like to have a lot of different cards that have varying degrees of impact in each matchup, but come in similar spots. So a good example of this might be when I won the SCG in Atlanta a couple months ago. I had a Stone of Eric, a Nihil Spell Bomb, a Surgical Extraction, and I had main deck Dothies. And I think I had like 2 Surgical and like 1 Nile, 1 Stone. So I had 4 Graveyard Hate cards, and I had some main deck Graveyard Hate. And they were all very different. And they were good in different spots for different reasons. Like, if I played against Yogg, I really wanted Stone, but I didn't really want these other cards. Or maybe I only want Stone and Nihil, depending on kind of how I was sideboarding at the time. Whereas against a deck like Living In, I really want Spell Bomb and Surgical. I don't really want this Stone of Eric unless like I have to make room and use its clunky Graveyard Hate mode. And so I kind of have a multiple cards coming in, and they are varying degrees of like, let's say 8 out of 10 and a 5, but they're coming in all those spots. I'm kind of hoping to have it line up the correct way. And it sort of ends up with what, as I imagine, a mesh web sideboard. And so that's why you see a lot of my sideboards. There's a lot of cards that maybe look like they're targeting the same thing, but it's because one is better in this spot, one is better in the other spot, but they both come in the same spots.
I love a good 7-2 matchups. That's the chef's kiss, baby. You get like that Tranquil Frill back, and you're like, oh, look at this. This is a 7 here and a 6 here, and like kind of like a 5.5 here even. Like, it's just a strict upgrade. Like, let's go. It's always the best. Yep. Thank you so much, Susanna, for the question. We really appreciate it, and we appreciate your support. If you want to join the conversation, like Susanna, head on over to patreon.com, join /CCMDG, join the Discord. There's a public Discord. We got fantasy football going on. We got limited talk going on there. If you're like a limited gamer, you want to do that, head on to the public Discord. And then the YouTube comments. You know, I just shout out to like the YouTube community that is really growing for us right now compared to where it was a year ago. We see you, we hear you, and you know, those active efforts you have to smash that like button and leave those comments, they actively help. This week's last show got only 1 comment and half the likes and got half the views. And like, so I see it. I see you, I recognize you, and I just want you to know I love you. And then head on over to twitter.com/ccmtg to get the shorts, the updates, as well as TikTok, CCMTG Pod, to kind of get like, you know, the fun clips. Mason, where can people find you?
Find me on Twitter at Mason E. Clark. You can find me at twitch.tv/TheMasonClark. You can find me each and every other week on TCG Player. This week I'll be writing about Duskmorn previews, specifically in the context of Pioneer, leading into the RC. So you can check out some more thought out things about Pyroclasm, like we talked about earlier, maybe some other cards that are exciting to me or potentially the format. And then reach out for coaching at Mason E. Clark on Twitter and at MasonEClark@gmail.com. Put coaching in the description. I'm getting pretty booked up when it comes to the RC. I always just work like 60 hours the week of the RC, so I have more time. But I still have a couple who want to get that, or if you want to start soon after that, feel free to reach out and we can book ahead of time. I have plenty of people who are like, oh, I've been busy the next 3 weeks. I would like to start coaching that later. Is that okay? That is fine. I just kind of wanted to say that here because I never really mentioned it before.
Awesome. You can follow me at Heezy Game on Twitter. You can, follow me at Heezy Game, Spencer13 Heezy on TikTok. And then, I just want to give a shout out to Abe. We missed you this week, man. Follow him at More Nothings. And then I think it's at More Nothings at gmail.com for coaching as well. So,
yeah, I think he's waiting until after the RC to start back up again. But yep.
There we go. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you all next time with a brand new episode of Constructed Criticism.